right, well, good morning. It's great to be back here with you again. If you have your Bible, go ahead and open to the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 3 is where we're going to be this morning. And if this is your first time tuning in, well, first of all, welcome. We're so glad that you're tuning in here. We're a new church plant here in Nordonia. And this morning, we're going to be in the third part of a series that we're going through the book of Daniel. Right? And I said a couple weeks ago that Daniel it's an interesting book because the book of Daniel, the first 6 chapters are filled with stories that if you grew up in Sunday school, you probably heard about several of these stories. Right? And there's a few confusing parts. We talked about chapter 2 where there was some prophecy last week, and chapter 5 is a little bit confusing, but for the most part, these are stories that we're familiar with. But then the second half of the book is filled with all sorts of just difficult topics to understand. And so for that reason, we said that this would be a great chapter for us to look at in 2020. And that's because the book of Daniel's called the prophet of the end time and the meantime. It has to do with how things are going to end, but then also how we should live right now in the meantime. And like I said, 2020 is, if we're just being completely honest, 2020 has been a complete dumpster fire, right? I mean, there's racial unrest. We're living in the middle of a pandemic. I still can't even wrap my mind around what that means. There's all sorts of unrest and uncertainty and unknown. And so we said the book of Daniel is a perfect book for us to be in now, not just because people are asking, is this the end of the world? But also because the book of Daniel, the theme is that even in the midst of uncertainty, God is in control. Even in the midst of uncertainty, God is in control. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this morning, and we're going to see this on display in what probably is the second most famous story in the book of Daniel, and it has to do with the fiery furnace. So Daniel chapter 3, I'm going to read from there, just the first 7 verses. While you're hopefully still turning there and finding it, let me just remind you, like Priya said earlier, we've got kids' resources on our website. And this morning's a special one because we have a full VeggieTales episode on the website. If you grew up watching VeggieTales, you know about Rack, Shack, and Benny being thrown in the fiery furnace because they didn't bow down to the giant chocolate bunny. If you're not a VeggieTales person, that made absolutely no sense. But we've got that episode for you guys on our resources page. And then also, I just want to encourage you guys to, we're doing a chapter a week, and so you can read ahead, and when you read ahead, it makes me a better preacher, because you're able to kind of, understand a little bit more what I'm talking about and what I'm breaking down. So I just encourage you guys, maybe as a family, maybe you just read the chapter ahead the night before on Saturday night, and then when we're digging into the Word together, it might make a little bit more sense. All right, so Daniel chapter 3 is where we're going to read from. I'm going to read the first 7 verses, and then I'll pray, and then we'll dive into it. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. And he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace." Verse 7, therefore, as soon as the people heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Let me pray. Father, thank you for your word. Father, thank you that we can still gather like this. This might not be ideal, but Lord, I thank you for technology so that we can study your word together even while we can't be physically together. Lord, I pray for clarity this morning. May you speak through me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so many of you, I think for the most part, most of you have met me in person if you're watching this. And when you meet me for the first time, it won't take you long to realize that I am a committed, faithful, long-suffering, loyal, trying to think of other adjectives, optimistic Cleveland sports fan. Okay, I brought this as an illustration. Don't worry, I'm not going to leave this up on the whole for the whole sermon. I got this as just an illustration, right? I'm a Cleveland sports fan, whether we're talking about football, whether we're talking about baseball, basketball, even soccer, hockey. I actually just found out that Cleveland has a professional rugby team. I had no idea. They're called the Cleveland Rovers. Okay, so go Rovers. If they have Cleveland on the front of the jersey, I'm a fan. How much of a fan, you ask? Well, when Cleveland didn't win a game, they didn't win a single game a couple years ago. They went 0-16. If you lived up here in Cleveland, you might remember that the fans held an 0-16 parade. Well, I couldn't be left out from the fun, so I held my own 0-16 parade down in Dallas. And the Dallas News was called, and they ran an article about me. And I probably should have been embarrassed, but I wasn't embarrassed because I'm a fan. Amanda and I she's not a Cleveland sports fan. She's a fan of Northern Kentucky teams. But our daughter, Ada, we decided to raise her a Dallas fan because she was born in Dallas. And so we said we're going to raise her and let her be a Dallas fan so we won't have any strife in the house there. But even Amanda says that she hopes that Ada marries a Cleveland sports fan because Cleveland sports fans are long-suffering and loyal and really take for better and for worse seriously. I'm a huge, huge fan. But no matter how big of a fan I am, at the end of the day, I'm only a fan. See, if the Cleveland Browns are on the 1-yard line about to this will decide if they are going to go to the Super Bowl. They're not calling me into the game. If the Cleveland Indians are in Game 7 of the World Series, they're not calling me to pitch hit or to pitch run, right? The Cleveland Rovers, if they're doing whatever rugby teams do and they need some help, they're not calling me because, one, I know nothing about rugby, but two, because I'm just a fan. I can put on this jersey. I could even customize this jersey and put my name on the back and take pictures and post them on social media and dress up in the pads and go out onto the field. Well, no, I can't go out onto the field. I can get down as close to the field as I possibly can. But at the end of the day, I'm not getting into the game because I'm just a fan. There are a lot of people in our world today who call themselves Christians who are really just fans of Jesus. They might slap his name on the front of their jersey, their metaphorical jersey. They might call themselves Christians. They might even like Jesus a lot. They might post Bible verses about Jesus on social media, but they're not actually part of the team. They're just fans. But what's amazing is that God himself, Jesus, has given us an invitation to not just be fans, but to actually be part of the team, to participate in the game. He's given us the opportunity to actually enter in to the game. There's a book I read a couple years ago. It became one of my favorite books. It's called Not a Fan. It's by Kyle Idleman. A couple quotes here from the book I want to share with you guys. He says, number one, the biggest threat to the church today is fans who call themselves Christians but aren't actually interested in following Christ. They want to be close enough to Jesus to get all the benefits, but not so close that it requires anything from them. And one other quote from this book, Not a Fan. It says, fans don't mind him doing a little touch-up work, but Jesus wants complete renovation. See, fans come to Jesus thinking tune-up, but Jesus is thinking overhaul. Fans think a little makeup is fine, but Jesus is thinking makeover. Fans think a little decorating is required, but Jesus wants a complete remodel. Fans want Jesus to inspire them, but Jesus wants to interfere with their lives. So what does that look like? How do we move from being just fans to committed followers of Jesus? How do we know if we're a fan or if we're actually on Christ's team? How do we move from just being fans, maybe even super fans, to actually entering into the game? Well, that's what we're going to look at today, and it starts by looking at our good friend, King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you've been tracking along with us in this series, then you remember that we left off last week, Nebuchadnezzar, he seemed like he was getting it. At the end of chapter 2, this is right after Daniel had revealed this dream to Nebuchadnezzar through, God had revealed the dream to Daniel. And if you missed that message, you can go back and listen to it on our YouTube channel. But look here, let me read starting in verse 46 of chapter 2. It says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him." Verse 47, the king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Right, so it seems like Nebuchadnezzar is so close to getting it. See, he's almost there. He says, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries." I mean, this is an amazing proclamation. I wasn't even going to go here, but this is something that the most of people in our world can't even say. Right, to proclaim the name of God, to say that God is Lord of lords, King of kings. This is an amazing declaration. We can't look past that. But look at what else he says. He says, "For you, Daniel, have been able to reveal this mystery." And he's given praises here to who? To Daniel. See, Nebuchadnezzar is a fan of God. He's impressed by God, but he hasn't completely and totally surrendered himself and committed his life to the one true God. He knows that God is the God of gods, but he doesn't know the God of gods. So before we even get into chapter 3, one of the things we need to realize this morning is that knowledge about God does not equate to a relationship with God. Let me read that again. Knowledge about God does not equate to a relationship with God. Here at the chapel, our mission is the 4 B's. We call them the 4 B's. We want to see people believing in Jesus, belonging to family, becoming disciples, and building his kingdom, building Christ's kingdom. This is, we call them the 4 B's. If you go to any of our campuses, hanging up somewhere, you'll see the 4 B's. And Lord willing, as soon as we get back into a location, you'll see the 4 B's hanging up at our campus. Let me just focus in on the first one. We want to see people believing in Jesus. This doesn't mean we want to see people just believing in the existence of Jesus. This doesn't mean we just want people to believe that Jesus was a real person that walked on earth 2,000 years ago. No, it means we want people to have a saving faith in Jesus. To say, yes, I believe that Jesus is fully God and that it's because of his death that now I can live for all eternity. It's only through putting my trust in him that we can have eternal life. And we see here that Nebuchadnezzar, this king of Babylon, had not yet surrendered his life to the one true God. He knew who God was, but he didn't know God. So how do we know that he hadn't laid it all down yet? Well, because just 3 verses later, at the start of chapter 3, he's building a golden image to himself. And I hope you caught the repetition in that chapter as I was reading that earlier. I hope you caught that repetition, right? The author of the book of Daniel, right? He's not like me, an undergrad, just trying to fill a word count quota. That's not why he's just repeating himself over and over again. No, he's using that to put emphasis on the fact that Nebuchadnezzar had set this image up. The same Nebuchadnezzar who was just impressed by Daniel and the interpretation of the dream. The dream, if you remember from last week, said that Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom were represented by a golden head on the statue. And Nebuchadnezzar said, hey, that's cool and all, but I want to be the whole statue. Right, so he made an image of himself out of gold. Now I find this to be really interesting. And if you're a fan of history, you might find this interesting as well. Now most scholars believe that the events in chapter 3 were roughly 8 to 10 years after the events of Daniel 2. And what's interesting about that is that there's historical evidence outside of the Bible that shows that there was an uprising in Babylon around 596 BC. You don't need to know the dates, but there was an uprising in Babylon right around this time, and there's historical evidence that Nebuchadnezzar called all of the rulers back to Babylon for a loyalty oath. Okay, so this would explain why Daniel wasn't there, because Daniel had stayed in the king's court. He didn't need to be called back like all these people who are being called back to make this loyalty oath. Look at the end of chapter 2 again. It says, then the king gave Daniel high honors and many gifts after he interpreted the dream, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king. He appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. Okay, so while extra biblical sources don't make mention of the statue, it's not a huge leap to suggest that there was an edict here very similar to the one we see in chapter 3 with this loyalty pledge. And so this it just blows my mind all the time that people try and disprove the Bible and say this isn't historically accurate. And then I love when there's these archaeological findings that just prove that the Bible is actually right, that the author knew what he was talking about. Okay, so what is this pledge that they had been called back, this loyalty oath that they had to make? Well, we read it earlier, but let's look again in verse 4. Verse 4, and the herald proclaimed aloud, you are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe. Side note, I just thought of this. That must have been the most horrific sound. Like, can you imagine all of that just playing at the same time? A horn, a pipe, a lyre, a trigon, a harp, and a bagpipe. That's some kind of sound right there. But it says, when you hear all of this music, you are to fall down, worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Okay, so this brush that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2 with the one true living God clearly had not softened his brutality. Right? He's not ripping people's arms and legs off and turning people into a pile of limbs, but he's burning them alive for not bowing down to the statue. This is still pretty high on the evil scale. I don't know if there's any Dr. Horrible fans out there, but Nebuchadnezzar would have gotten an invite to the evil league of evil. I know I lost half of you right there, but some of you caught that reference. Okay, so this guy, he was severely messed up. So what happens? Well, Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get ratted out by the Chaldeans. The wise men from southern Babylon, they bring charges against Daniel's friends, maybe out of jealousy, maybe because they see a strategic opportunity to take their place. But look at what it says in verse 12. This is the Chaldeans talking. They say, hey, king, there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province in Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Okay, so this is a calculated attack. They're essentially saying, hey, king, these men that you set up, they don't listen to you. They don't listen to your gods. They don't like your gods, which side note, this was more than just religious indifference. See, Nebuchadnezzar would have believed that the gods were his claim to being king. So if you don't follow his gods, then that means that you don't see him as king. And then they say that they won't bow to this image that you have set up. Now, side note, why are these wise men so mad? Like, why are they so jealous? You would think that they'd still be thanking Daniel and his friends for saving their lives in chapter 2. Because they were about to be turned into a pile of rubble and limbs, which is less than ideal. But once Daniel and his friends prayed, then they were saved. So why are they so mad? Well, like I mentioned in week 1, the Chaldeans were natives of southern Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar himself actually was a Chaldean. But Daniel and his friends were outsiders. Yet they had positions in Nebuchadnezzar's administration that were higher than the Chaldeans. And so I think that there's an evidence that there was a deeper disdain than just those 3 men, that it ran deeper than that, because in verse 8 it says that their attack was against the Jews. All right, so they're doing everything they can to get rid of them because they're upset, and so they rat them out, and the king is infuriated. Look at verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well, good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? This is fascinating to me. He's essentially saying, come on now. You're not that crazy. See, I don't think that Nebuchadnezzar here is actually challenging God. I think to him it's just not even conceivable that someone would go against his authority. And it's definitely not even conceivable that another God could be more powerful than him to save them. See, I think he said it more like, is it Nebuchadnezzar, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are you really not bowing? Like why? Who's going to save you? There's no God that's going to save you from this. Look at verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. At first glance, that seems incredibly disrespectful. If you're a parent, especially if you're a parent of a teenager or preteen, imagine that one of your kids comes home late. Maybe they snuck out. I'm not encouraging this, kids. But they were supposed to be at home, and they snuck out, and they come home, and you say, where have you been? And they say to you, I have no need to answer you in that matter. I'm sure for some of you, your blood is starting to boil even just thinking about that. I get goosebumps. If I would have said that to my parents, I think my face would be like shifted this way by at least 2 inches. So what's going on here? Why are they just being disrespectful? Well, we'll catch this. It almost reminds me of another person in the Bible who was questioned by authority. Another person who was on trial and was about to be executed in a horrendous fashion, and he remained quiet instead of defending himself. Talking about Jesus. So why in both of these instances do we see them have this attitude against authority? Well, let me first say that if our first instinct is to read this passage or passages like it and say, yes, they're sticking it to the man, well, then I think we're missing the point. See, this is not a passage that shows us that we need to rebel against authority, but it's showing us that we have no higher authority than the God of heaven. We have no higher authority than our Creator God. See, this goes all the way back to what we were talking about in chapter 1, right? Daniel and his friends, they've been taken into a foreign land. They're stripped of their identities and their language and their families and their cultures, but they draw a line in the sand and say, we will not eat the king's food. They draw the line with their diet, not because they're trying to lose weight, but no, because they recognize that under the covenant law that they have been given by their God, they could not eat the food that would make them seen as unclean before their Creator. They said, we will not waver on this. And God provided a miracle. See, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not just fans of God. A fan would have said, hey, I'll bow down. I can actually be more effective in ministry if I bow down to this idol so that I can stay alive, and then I might try and make some converts. But no, they weren't just fans. They were followers. They were part of God's team. And catch this rocked me when I realized this week. I've been reading these stories in Daniel since I was my daughter's age, but I hadn't caught this, and this was 12 years after they had been brought into captivity. See, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been in this foreign culture for at least over a decade, and it could have been so easy for them to have caved by now. Or they could have been absorbed by the culture, but because they drew a line in the sand back in chapter 1 and said, we're not going to eat the king's food, we see the ramifications of that decision here in chapter 3. See, friends, if you're a follower of Christ, if you're a follower, then there should be a radical difference between you and your unsaved friends. If the only difference between you and your unsaved friends is that you go to church when it's convenient, you might even share, you tell people, hey, I'll pray for you. You might like some Bible posts on Facebook. Well, then may I lovingly suggest to you that maybe you're more of a fan than actually part of Christ's team. And hear my heart in this, please. I'm not saying that you need to act a certain way in order to be a Christian. That's legalism. No, I'm saying that if our hearts have truly been transformed by Jesus, if we're on his team, then we're going to live a certain way that makes the rest of the world look at us kind of funny. See, it's impossible to live like Jesus and live like the world at the same time. Amanda and I and Ada, over this past summer, we've been going to the beach on my off day every day, or every off day that I have. Not every day. That would be awesome to go to the beach every day. But on my off day, we go to Edgewater Beach up in Cleveland. And this past week, we were there for probably the last time because the weather's starting to change. And Ada wanted me to help her make a sandcastle. And by sandcastle, her version of a sandcastle is just digging a deep hole. It's the opposite of a sandcastle, but she's 3. And so I'm helping her dig this hole. And I was trying to tell her, hey, if you want me to dig a hole, we need to move farther up the beach away from the water. But she wanted to dig this hole right next to the water. I told her it wasn't going to work, but she's 3. And so every 30 seconds, as can be expected, the wave would come in and fill in the water, or fill in the hole. And I keep digging it, and I keep trying, but the water keeps coming in and filling, and eventually I gave up. And within just a few minutes after I gave up, the spot where we had been digging and agonizing and sweating, blood, sweat, and tears for like 2 minutes right there in that hole, it no longer looked any different than the rest of the shoreline. See, so many people want to build their Christian lives right next to the waters of this world. And as a result, our progress is stunted as the waters of this life beat down and drown out our attempts at following Christ, and often we're left looking no different than the rest of the world. Now, I'm not saying we need to become monks, right, and just live in isolation and have nothing to do with the world, but no, like Jesus taught us, we're to be in the world, but not of the world. And we see this modeled here by these 3 young men. Let me just say as a side note as well, accountability is key. Right? There's 3 of them. They were able to hold themselves accountable. It's hard enough to follow Christ, but it's easier to follow Christ in this dark world when we have accountability. And so I just wanted to show this real quick. Here at the chapel, I said we follow the 4 B's. We want to see people believing in Jesus, belonging to family, becoming disciples, and building his kingdom. All right, so the second 2, belonging to family and becoming disciples, that has to do with community. Right? And so these are, I want to call these the 1, 2, 3s of the Chapel Nordonia. And so we want to focus on having community and belonging to family and becoming disciples at all 3 of these levels. Okay, so we have about 75, 80 people who are committed to our team right now, and hopefully as we continue to grow, we'll be around this 100 range and then start to grow from there as well. But when we get back together, for sure, we want to have community at this 100 people level. But also with our gatherings that we're having. Right? We want to have a lot of people, but it's hard to have real community with 100 people. Right? So the next level, the 2, is 20. So whether it's a small group or a home group, and I know that for some of you, home groups, they don't work with your family, and that's understandable, but we also have Zoom home groups where people watch the services and then jump onto a Zoom call, and so you can have this community at this range right here. And then we also want to have real intimate community with just 3 or 4 other men or other women or even other children that can spur us on in our walk with the Lord. So I'll be talking more about this later after this Daniel series, but this is kind of our discipleship strategy for the Chapel Nordonia, having community with 100 people, 20 people, and 3 people. Just wanted to tease that out there because we see this happening down here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego holding themselves accountable. And accountability is huge. So look back at verse 17. We're going to pick up the pace here a little bit. They say, "We don't even need to answer you, king. If this be so," in other words, if we're thrown into the furnace, "our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." Verse 18, "But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." And this is huge. They said, our God is able to save us from the fire. But even if he doesn't, we're still not bowing down to your image. Even if he doesn't save us, he's still God. See, this is a genuine recognition of the power and the position and the sovereignty of God. As I was studying this week, there were 2 things that really struck me like never before in this chapter. The first was an observation of how much this is a stark contrast to what we see in 21st century American Christianity. See, we love a God who rescues us from the fire. We love verse 17. We love a God who we can give all the credit to when all the bills are paid and when we get a promotion that we've been praying for. We love a God that we can sing 10,000 praises to, right, as the song says. But what about when the answer to our prayer is no? Or when we just can't seem to hear God in our life, or he's seemingly silent, then do we still keep him on the throne of our lives? Because that's exactly what we see modeled here. The second realization I had this week was that the edict that Nebuchadnezzar gave, the edict in and of itself, was not what made him evil. Let me say that again. The edict that Nebuchadnezzar was going to throw people in the fiery furnace if people didn't bow down to him, that edict in and of itself was not evil. What made it evil was that he did not have the qualifications to make that claim. You see, what he did was not completely unlike something else we see in the Bible. If you go to Revelation 20, verse 12, it says, I'll just read it. It says, I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book which was opened, which was the book of life. Jump down to 15. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. All right, we don't like to talk about this in church, right? Is God doing what Nebuchadnezzar did in Daniel chapter 3? Don't miss this. What made Nebuchadnezzar evil, what made Nebuchadnezzar's edict evil, was not the edict in and of itself, but it's that he did not have the authority or the righteousness to make such a claim. He did not have the authority or the righteousness to demand a life for the refusal to bow down to him because, like you and I, Nebuchadnezzar was also deserving of the fiery furnace. See, stay with me here. One of the questions that I get as a pastor, probably actually one of the most asked questions that I get asked is how can a loving God send people to hell? How can a loving God send people to hell? It makes us uncomfortable. And the reason why it makes us uncomfortable is because for many of us, the doctrine of God and hell seems a lot like Nebuchadnezzar and the fiery furnace. But it's a world of difference. Here's why. See, the Bible tells us in Romans that the wages of sin is death, which means, in other words, as soon as we're born, we have this disease called sin, and we're destined for hell, and we don't escape it by our good works. No, it's because of the wondrous grace of God that those who are his children, we don't get what we ultimately deserve. See, the image is actually swapped, that it would be like if Nebuchadnezzar knew that everyone was going to go into the fiery furnace. But he said, hey, all you have to do is bow down to me and you won't have to go in. See, the image is swapped, but why do we need to bow? Are we just feeding God's ego like Nebuchadnezzar's ego was being filled? No, it's because he alone is worthy of our praise. It's because we're sinful creatures who have sinned against an infinite God, and so our sin deserves an infinite penalty. And here's the wonder of it all. God laid himself down. He laid down his crown and said, you can't do this on your own. So I'm coming down into history. I love how the Ask Pastor Chase question perfectly lined up with the sermon. I didn't even plan that. But God stepped down into history and took the punishment that we deserved. Does this make you uncomfortable? Because fans of Christ don't like this. And it's even difficult for some followers of Christ as well, but God's word says it, and therefore we have to believe it. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't like the fact that they wouldn't bow down to him, and so it infuriates him even more. Look at verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Like, why would you need to heat the furnace even hotter? Right? Sometimes our anger makes us do irrational things. But Nebuchadnezzar is angry. Look at verse 24. His anger quickly turns to astonishment. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in a haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men into the fire?" They answered and said, "True, O king." Verse 25, he answered and said, But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. There was another one in the fire with them. And we're not told exactly who this fourth individual was, whether it was an angel or many people, myself included, believe that it was a pre-incarnate Jesus that was with them in the fire. We're not told with certainty, but we're also not told if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saw the fourth person. Like, there could have been this fourth person in there that they didn't even realize was in there with them. But regardless of if it was Jesus or an angel, this is still incredible because it shows that God is caring for us and God is with us, even in the most difficult parts of our lives. I'm not spending a lot of time on this because we're running out of time, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. See, this is so important that whether it was Jesus or someone sent by God, God meets us in the fire. And this fire, this trial, ended up being a witness to someone whose heart was hardened like Nebuchadnezzar. Then to close out the story, verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. I wish we could spend all morning on that verse. Don't miss that. They went into the furnace. Scholars believe that furnace could have been as hot as 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. They went into the fire. In verse 26, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. Verse 27, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power on those men. The hair of their head was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angels and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Verse 29, therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. Their houses shall be laid to ruin, for there is no other God who's able to rescue in this way. He still got it a little backwards. He's still trying to tear people to pieces. He's getting closer. But see, Nebuchadnezzar is still a fan. He doesn't surrender his own life down to before God. He just says no one else can speak ill about God. But he still hasn't completely surrendered his life. We talked a little bit about the 4 B's, and the fourth is building, where we want to build Jesus' kingdom. And I wish I could tell you that if you were on Christ's team, your life would just be easy. But no, there will be fire. And as the cultural opposition gets louder, so will the intensity of that heat. But we serve a God who meets us in the fire. And that's what we see in the ending here. I want to end today's service a little bit different than normal. Instead of our worship team coming back up and closing us in song all together, our worship leader, Nick Budo, he pre-recorded a song that lines up with today's message. And so I want to close by sharing this song with you guys. And another member of our team named Fermin Gomez, he did an artistic illustration while this song was playing. And so don't just turn this off. The sermon's not over. This is part of the sermon. All right. So I want to show you guys this video real quick, and then I'll be back up to close this out in a second.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears a burden where another died for me. There is another in the fire. All my debt left for dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. And should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning, either way I won't bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. And should I ever need reminding, would power set me free? There is a grave that holds nobody, and now the power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, 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 I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to him. I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between wears thin. I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come what may in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. I know I will never be alone. There'll be another in the fire, standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me, I'll count the joy from every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be.
Wow, I'm constantly impressed by the creativity of our team here in Nordonia. I love how that piece just encapsulates the fact that we're here to see people for those 4 B's, right? We're here to see people believing and belonging and becoming and building, but it's all centered around what? It's all centered around the name of Jesus. Right? We're here to see people believing in who? Believing in Jesus. We're here to see people belonging to what family? To this church family, yes, but belonging to the family of Jesus. We're here to see people becoming disciples of who? Disciples of Jesus, and building the kingdom of who? Building Jesus' kingdom. And that song that Nick was singing, I don't know if you caught that, but it says, there was another one in the fire, there is another one in the fire, and there will be another one in the fire. Let me say that again. There was, there is and there will be. And here's the thing, and we've been talking about this through this series, it's the same one. The same Jesus, the same God who was there with them in the fire is the same God that we're here worshiping this morning. It's the same God who's with us through our struggles. And we worship the same God today who showed up in that fiery furnace 2,600 years ago. And he's the same God who 600 years later would go on to send his one and only Son into a broken and dying world to bear the punishment that we deserve. And listen to me, that might have been 2,000 years ago. But what we do with the name of Jesus today means everything. See, we don't just get to slap his name on our jersey, if you will, and call ourselves part of Christ's team because our parents were Christians. We don't just call ourselves Christians simply because we hold to a set of moral standards or because we perform good deeds or because we want our life to go a certain way. No, we call ourselves Christians. We're part of Christ's team when we have completely and totally surrendered our lives to him. When we've totally committed ourselves not just to the mission of the 4 B's, but to him, to when our life, like that illustration, revolves around him. See, then we can call ourselves followers of Christ, part of Christ's team. When we say, Jesus, I can't do this, but you can. We say, just like we sang earlier, now, Lord, I would be yours alone and live so all might see that the strength to follow your commands could never come from me. So I don't know who's watching this right now. I don't know if you've never made that declaration. Maybe you've been more like Nebuchadnezzar. Right? More of a fan of Jesus, more of a fan than a follower. And if that's you, then let me just say, call out to him this morning. Like I said, I don't know exactly who's watching this right now. But what I do know is that even in a church of our size, it would be foolish for me to assume, to think that every single one of us is playing for the same team. It would be foolish for me to think that there's not anyone watching this right now who's maybe more of an admirer of Jesus. It would be foolish for me to think that there's no one watching this right now who's more of a fan of Jesus. Maybe someone's watching this, maybe you're watching this right now saying, hey, I just want, I think of Jesus as a good figure, a good role model. I want him to be someone my kids look up to you, and you haven't completely and totally surrendered your life to that Jesus. And so God, I ask right now that if there's any man or woman or child who's watching this right now, that you would just stir something in their hearts and just open the eyes of their heart to show them their need for you. God, would you show all of us our need for you this morning? Would you grab a hold of us and show us that you are with us in the fire, that you, will you help us, Lord, see that we need you? And if you're watching this right now, whoever you are and you're listening, let me just tell you, Jesus is calling out to you this morning, whether you're 90, whether you're 9, this is not something that you want to just push off till tomorrow, because tomorrow's not guaranteed. So as we close, what now? Well, we talked about the 1, 2, 3s, right? And the first one, the 100, that's going to be coming up next Sunday as we gather. So start to get your kickball teams ready, right? But we want everyone who's part of this church. Maybe you're watching, maybe you've been kind of on the outskirts and you've just been watching these services and you haven't connected with us. We want everyone to move from this 100 to these 2s and 3s. So we want you to get plugged into a small group and into a home group, and we're going to be rolling out our plan for discipleship in the 3 category there. But we want you to be a part of this. So if you're watching and you're just like, hey, I've never reached out and actually tried to connect with them, there's a website on the screen here that you can fill out a connect card, or you can text us or email us. Because this isn't a church where we just want to know facts about God. We don't want to just be fans of Jesus, but we want to be his followers. I'm a fan of the Cleveland Browns, even though they make it difficult sometimes. But there's only one that I'm completely sold out and committed to. There's only one that I'm a follower of, and his name is Jesus. So I've got to ask this morning, are you a follower or a fan? Father, thank you for everyone who's tuning into this service. Lord, I pray that you will just open up our hearts. Show us our need for you. Lord, don't let any of us leave this service just completely unchanged, but will you just stir something up in our hearts that points us and directs us to you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
This has been a message from the chapel. Thanks for joining us today. For more information about the chapel or any of our campuses, including Akron, Greene, Wadsworth, Kenmore, Cuyahoga Falls, and Nordonia, please go to our website at thechapel.life.